Please join me in welcoming Dr. Danny Sexton, Associate Professor of English. He has taught at Queensborough since 2013 and has been a faculty member since 2020, holding his current rank. He teaches courses in composition, queer English, and African American literature. His research examines how 19th century British and African American literature constructs and challenges ideas of race, gender, and masculinity and belonging. He is particularly interested in how literary texts from the Victorian novel to contemporary Black and queer writings reimagine identity, community, and cultural power across time. And now, Danny's current research is looking at literature representations of all Black towns and communities, and his findings will be the subject of a new book. Danny, thank you so much for talking with me today.
No, thank you.
Before we get to your latest work, I'm going to start back at the very beginning. What do you think sparked your research interest, particularly the fact that your work spans from Victorian literature to African American literature and queer studies? So what drew you to these areas?
So it's a combination. Part of it is my own personal background. So things that are related to me as a queer person, as an African American person. So they are the personal interests. But then also, I was just one of those people, I was fascinated by everything. I tell my students all the time, I am a certified geek. My parents had the World Book Encyclopedia, and I was one of those kids who's flipped through every issue of it. So everything intrigues me.
So starting when you were an undergraduate student, literature was the love, was the study?
So it was a long progression before I actually made it to my home in the English department. I started in architecture, flirted with history, flirted with accounting, then finally went to English. Well, I should have been all the time.
I see all the matches until you got to accounting. That was an interesting sidestep.
Yeah. That was outside pressure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And so before you got to Queensborough, were you working in higher education, or what were some of the things that you did before you got here?
So I started off immediately in higher education. So once I finished my bachelor's degree, I went immediately into a master's degree program, TA in English, then went straight from that into the PhD, straight out of the PhD into teaching. I taught at the Borough of Manhattan Community College for a while, and then went back to my alma mater, the University of Arkansas, and was there for 3 years before I came back to New York City in Queensborough.
What brought you back to New York City?
I really missed New York City. I found like the 3 years that I was in Arkansas, even though that's where I grew up, I was constantly missing New York City. And I was missing being in a community college environment. I was at a Research One institution, which has a lot of perks, but there was something about the community college environment that I really thought, this is my home. And so when this opportunity came up to come back, or to come to QCC, I grabbed it. Yeah.
And what is it that keeps you here at Queensborough?
I find that one of the things that, particularly here at Queensborough, and I know this is an expression that people have used before, but I feel like I have roots and wings here. I mean, like, I find that Queensborough grounds me, but at the same time, it gives me an opportunity to explore many different channels and avenues that I don't think I would have done at other institutions. So there's been a lot of opportunities that had presented themselves here.
And so what is it like sharing your love for all of your varied literature interests with your students here at Queensborough?
I sometimes think I overshare because I often joke with my students that I am the text, but I think what I often do is no matter what we're reading, I find the universal appeal to it. So today in my English 102 course, we were doing Sonny's Blues, James Baldwin's short story, which is one of my favorite stories of all time. And it's about two brothers. And this older brother and a younger brother. I'm an older brother, and so this appeals to me, and I have some of the older brother mentality, but at the same time, I can see where the younger brother is coming from. And the thing that I'm always trying to get students to realize, that even though the story may not be about your gender, your race, your situation, if it is well written, there's a universal quality in it. And I share my personal stories so that students can kind of find that way into the text for themselves.
And speaking of your personal stories and sharing, when I as I was reading your bio at the beginning, the one thing that kind of struck out to me is that it seems like a lot of your work sort of thrives in intersectionality. And that seems to be sort of a recurring theme. For instance, you've presented on LGBTQ plus experiences in Holocaust studies. So how does it help us understand intersectionality and historically in marginalized communities when you break it down through literature like that?
I mean, so I owe so much to James Baldwin. And he was my first real reading experience. And in reading Baldwin, he was so not caught up in labels. And he realized very early on that we are so many different things. And so when I look at literature, I'm always looking at how all these different aspects of ourselves coming to being that way. Because yeah, I'm a brother, but I'm a teacher. I'm a son, and these are all part of my identity, and I cannot put them in boxes. They all make up a part of who I am. And so that's some of the approach, because I can find a little bit of myself in almost anything that I read and I encounter.
And can the students appreciate that and see how they've got various identities and they come and go in different ways too?
Yes, I think they do. I mean, especially when we start talking about the literature, and I use myself as an example, but then as I get to know them, I also use them as an example. So as they share more with me, I'll go back and I reference them, and I say, yeah, like Andrew here, and so we'll bring that in because I want them to know that their experiences and their identities are a part of this journey. Because I think for a lot of us, I think we feel to be academic means that we have to cut out that part of ourselves. And I think that is so incorrect. I think that's very much how we pursue our interests.
I think about that a lot too. I had a previous guest and I talked about how it's an interesting time, I guess, when students recognize the value in their own narratives
Yes.
and their own stories. And I believe that comes from reading so many different ones. Do you see those moments in your students where they sort of make that connection of, I've experienced that, or that's part of me too?
Yeah.
What is that like when they make that connection?
It's the greatest moment in the classroom, and especially when they start to take ownership of that and when they share that, but also when they begin to analyze it. So in talking about Sonny's Blues today, we were very much talking about older siblings, and a few of my students are older siblings. And it's like, yes, that is exactly us to a T. But then they were also, even some of the younger siblings was like, yeah, that is such a younger sibling move. But then what I do is, because I walk this fine balance with English 102, because I joke with the students like, this class is about you, but it's not about you. But what I want you to do is take your experiences and try to use those to understand what the characters are going through. So if you're an older sibling, your paper, I don't want it to be about you, but because you're an older sibling, you now know what this older brother is going through. So you can take that same kind of mentality and use that to analyze what the older brother is doing. And that really works for them. They see that connection.
And so with that analyzing that happens, that also leads to a lot of critical discussion. And you've mentioned that that's a joy when you can sit back and you watch the students engage in this critical discussions with one another. What is that like to kind of serve as a mentor, guide, or a coach, if you will, as they are really tackling some of these topics?
It's tricky because sometimes, I walk that thin balance where I kind of like want to jump in. It's like, yeah, me too. But then I have to also kind of like step back. It's like, okay, no, this is your story. But then I also try to, like guiding questions to kind of make them try to make sense of it. Why did you act that way? Why did you behave that way? And I'm always like, say, look, if it becomes too personal and you don't want to talk about it, feel free. But I think most of the students, they really love that opportunity to talk about self. And when they're granted that opportunity in that space, that's when they really blossom. That's when they really shine.
And I know you're the professor in the class, but are there moments where you feel like you're learning something when they're shining in their...
All the time,
Yeah.
all the time. For instance, just the other day, there was a text, Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, which I've taught numerous times. And I was teaching it, and a student made a comment, and I stopped. I was like, that's not in that essay. She's like, yes, it is. I was like, where? And she flipped through it and she read it. I was like, OMG, I did not see that. And I was like, I'm going to be quiet for a moment. Explain more. And she just took over for about 10 minutes. And I was like, huh. But this is the key. I always tell my students that, look, we all come from different backgrounds. I'm a male from the South of a certain age. When I engage with literature, those are the ways that I read it. I was like, if you are a woman from a different religion than I am, you grew up differently than I am, you're younger than I am, you will see things that I won't see. And I want you to bring that to the table, because when you do that, I think we all benefit.
And I think that that's an interesting way to bring that to their attention, that it's not about right or wrong or one's better than the other. It's more difference.
Yeah.
And in a space of discussion, when you talk about differences, they don't seem so scary anymore.
No, not at all.
And it also creates a space, I would assume, where they can find some commonality.
Yeah. And that's what I'm always looking for in the literature. I always try to find texts that first appeal to me, because I think if I love it, that's going to come through when I'm teaching it. And not to say that they have to love it, but they'll see my passion in it. And then they'll say, yeah, I can be passionate about this and bring this to the table. So,
wow. So I want to switch gears just a bit, because we're going to work our way up to your latest project. But you mentioned part of what put you, I guess, in the space to sort of be thinking about this latest project was your fellowship leave.
Yes.
During the 23-24 academic year, and being a part of that first cohort of faculty who were in Queensborough's Unseen Threads initiative. You said they both greatly influenced your upcoming work. Could you walk me through both of those experiences and why they were so impactful?
Okay, so with the Unseen Threads, like going to Montgomery, Alabama, like going back to the South, because I'm from the South, and it's this interesting thing. There are things that you know because you've experienced them, but then you've not experienced them in an academic way. And so when you go back and you start to look at them academically, and this is more like teasing out the nuances, like why this happened, and you start to really analyze it, it gives you a different perspective on it. And so I'll draw a comparison to Zora Neale Hurston, who one of her works is going to feature in my book project. She grew up in an all-Black town, all-Black community in Florida, but it was only when she was in New York that she started to turn a critical attention to it. And then when she went back, that's when she was able to kind of like analyze it with a different mindset. And that's what Unseen Threads, going to Montgomery, because it's like, this is history that I know, but I know it so well that I've not really looked at it from a different perspective. So kind of like taking myself out of it to look at it critically. And what the fellowship leave did was it gave me an opportunity to read so much that I, like books that have been on my shelf, books that have been on my list. And I just read. But even that gave me the tools to go back and look at these all-Black towns and all-Black communities in a critical way that I had not been looking at beforehand.
I'm quite sure there were many things, but is there one thing that you can think of from the Unseen Threads experience that was a shift or gave you a different nuance in the way that you looked at an experience? Was there one thing, or many?
There was something about, there's the sculpture park in Montgomery, Alabama, but there's also the kiosk where you can plug in your family's last name.
Yes.
And what it does, it kind of gives you the origin of your family and how much of your family lived in a certain part of the country at a certain time period. So I plugged in my father's last name and then my mother's name, and then started to see where my family were. And those connections, and I thought, wow. Because once again, it's one of those things that I never really thought about until that kind of brought it home to me. Yeah.
In full disclosure, I went on that trip with you, so I don't want to act like I'm very surprised by your answers, but I do remember that moment of in that kiosk. That was a powerful moment when you type in your family name, and I also did my mother's maiden name, and to be able to see the county and how many people with that last name were captured in that very first census right after slavery ended. And it was, I think I've always known that, yes, I'm a descendant of slaves, but I think seeing my name on a legal document when there's really not a lot of history for people, it did kind of, it almost brought me to tears when I saw that. Yeah.
And I think that goes back to what I was trying to do in the classroom, because I think there's a part, I mean, and even the name of the program, Unseen Threads, there's such an importance to being seen. And not only being seen by others, but also being able to see yourself. And I think that a lot of times what we do is we can see others, but I sometimes think we don't spend enough time actually seeing ourselves. And then when we see ourselves reflected, that really changes the narrative.
And so I know just from discussions on the trip, in those moments, it made you reflect about your own experience of growing up, not just in the South, but in an all-Black town.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about, just from a learned experience, what it was like? And did you even realize there was a difference growing up?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because I did not. Just because that's where I grew up and it's what I knew, it never occurred to me that this was anything special. It's only until I started to do the research and I started to read the history of all these all-Black towns and all-Black communities, I was like, oh, wow, this is my history. And it filled me with a little bit of regret, because there were old-timers. I'm not sure that's the right phrase to use, but let's just go with that. That were in my hometown that would have had access to a lot of history, that had I known when I was a teenager in my early 20s to reach out to them and to ask them those stories, that's a lot of history that I could have picked up on. And most of those people are no longer there. So there's a little bit of regret that I did not come to this sooner. But at the same time, it was also, I was very grateful that I did come to it, because I think it is a part about just looking at your origins. And I didn't think about it until I started doing the research about what it meant to grow up in an all-Black town, in an all-Black community, and the people there, and that sense of community that I had as a kid, and that the people that I grew up with had as children.
And I'm wondering, did your research uncover, or did it, show you some of the through lines, if you will, that many of these all-Black towns were not formed by choice?
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of it was necessity, that sense of freedom, but also joy to kind of shape your own community, your own lives, to kind of be in charge, when at a time, historically, a lot of Black people didn't have that opportunity. And so the fact that my parents, my family home is still there in my hometown. And whenever I do go back, it's like the streets are just littered with memories, and it's that connection out of necessity, which one of the things that I'm struggling with the research, because I think, yes, there was a time in history where these all-Black towns and community was necessary, but one of the questions that I'm struggling with now, is it still necessary? And I don't quite know just yet.
And is it still necessary for the same needs?
That's a good question. That's a good distinction, because I don't think it is. That I think it has changed, because right after the Civil War, and some of these all-Black towns and communities also existed a little bit before the Civil War, where you started to do some of the research. But during that time period, there was a particular reason why they existed. But then as we moved on, maybe there's still a reason, but it's a different reason. And it's kind of like teasing out what those reasons are. And also, it's not one size fit all. Because initially when I started the research, I thought, I'm going to get the answer, and I'm going to use this answer, and this will explain every all-Black town in the community everywhere in the United States. And as I did more research, I realized, no, that's not how it works.
Are any of them still left?
So yes, there are a number of them in Oklahoma. But and then there's one in Louisiana as well, really well-known one. Oh, why is the name escaping me? Mounds Bayou, which is really well written about, well documented. And in Oklahoma, there was one named Boley, Oklahoma. It still exists. But the problem with a lot of them, the numbers of the citizens and the population has drastically declined. So at one time, if you look at their heyday, the populations were really high. Some of them had their own schools, their own hospitals, their own post offices. Now, so many of them don't.
So it's just the homes, maybe one general store.
Yeah, exactly. And some of them have been unincorporated, so they're not officially towns anymore. Some of them, they've lost their post offices. Younger generations, they grow up, they go off to university, and they move to larger cities. And so you don't have the growth anymore. You particularly see it in churches and church memberships, because when I go back home, my dad's church, most of the membership now are older people, very few young people there. And it's somewhat sad, yeah.
For people who may not be familiar with the history of all-Black towns, what's one story or insight about the towns that really stands out to you?
Let's see. Okay, like for some of them, it was that sense of just like Black businesses. And if you think about, even though this is not a town, but in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where you had Greenwood, and this Black community that was thriving, movie theaters, stores, the sense, they called it Black Wall Street, right? Where you had all this, where people could just be themselves. And I found that really interesting about some of them. But then also what was interesting too is like how a lot of these towns became representative of a single figure. Like if there's a particular, and usually it was a man who founded the city. And so he often had so much control. And in a negative sense, the city became him. And when he died, the cities would often die as well, because the city was tied so much to that character or to that man.
What are some of the things that you'd like to explore or uncover or share in your forthcoming book?
One of the things that I really want to focus on is how novelists and playwrights use the all-Black towns in their literature. And like one of the people that I speak of the most is Toni Morrison. She wrote a novel, Paradise, which in all the things that I've read, she has done the most, or she did the most historical research into all-Black towns. Because if you read Paradise, and if you're familiar with the history of all-Black towns, you can just see that she did her research. But then some of the works, the all-Black town is there, and you can tell that the author has taken a lot of liberties. And so like the author is imagining what this town could be. So you kind of like walk this very thin line between, is this a historical representation? Is this an imaginary representation? Or is it a little blending of both? And so that's what I'm trying to tease out as I explore these different literary treatments.
And you also mentioned playwrights.
Yeah, so there...
One in particular?
Yes, there's a play called Flying West by, I can't remember her first name. Her last name is Klieg. And what she does is, so a lot of all-Black towns were formed in the West, like you got Oklahoma, Kansas. She imagines an all-Black town created by women, which is not part of the historical narrative that you often see. And so it was interesting in this play that she makes the focus on women. And women were definitely a part of these all Black towns and all communities, but as so often happens in history, the woman narrative gets suppressed and we don't often see it, or it's not often able to shine as much as it should. And the good thing about her play is that she shines the spotlight on that.
I gotta look for that.
Yeah.
You mentioned a little earlier just talking about Rosewood and Black Wall Street in Tulsa. Those are often discussed.
Yeah.
So how do you hope your research will expand our understanding of these all Black towns across the United States, and why it's so important that we learn about them?
Okay, so one of the things is I want to like show that there's so many of them existed, because as you said, you're right. There are some of the ones that we pick or that are selected, and those become the stories, and then we think to ourselves, well, this is the story, and all of them must have worked this way. But that's not true. There were a number of them in California as well, but the ones in California were more like resort getaways. And so you would have a lot of African Americans who lived in Los Angeles, but they would create these resort vacation towns that they would escape to. And so it was like a whole different narrative. And so it kind of showed like these all Black towns and all Black communities. And that's why I'm using communities as well.
Interesting.
Because they existed in a lot of different variations. And so I kind of want to get that sense that they were so expansive. But I want to kind of look at not only the past, but I also want to look at the present and the future of these towns as well. And then once again, that's one of those things that I'm teasing out in the research.
This was an aha moment because I'm thinking all Black towns. I went to these were formed as a result of the community, but I didn't even give thought to the other side of the coin. And when you were just talking about that, it made me think of Dorothy West's
Yes.
The Wedding.
Yes, that is one.
And that
is
just
one.
hit me. That's another one.
Yeah, because it's that little enclave
Yes.
of Martha's Vineyard, right? And so much of Dorothy West, The Wedding, deals with that community.
One community.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
Didn't even think about that, but that was a really good aha moment. So that really sort of changes the narrative from not only out of necessity because African Americans couldn't, but the necessity when we finally could.
Yes. Yeah.
And for the few that could, and what they wanted to create to still extend that experience within their new bracket, if you will.
Yeah, what becomes interesting about Dorothy West, The Wedding, and Colson Whitehead does this in one of his novels called Sag Harbor, which also I didn't learn until I read Whitehead. There was a little enclave in Sag Harbor. There was an all Black community.
I have visited it.
Yeah, But in Colson Whitehead's novel, these are people who normally live in the city, New York City, and I don't want to say escape, but they go there for the summer. And I think that, as you said, that changes the narrative because there are the communities where people are living there 365 days a year, but then there are the ones that people go there for the summer or to vacation. And what does that mean?
What does that mean?
Yeah.
Will some of your research take you to these places to travel and to really sit down with locals? Is that something you have done or would like to do?
So I've done a little bit of it, but I want to do more of it, particularly Sag Harbor, I've been there. So to go back there, my own hometown, which I still go to, even though my parents are no longer around, I still go back and just kind of like the sense, I think, to walk the streets, even if it's not talking to people, to walk the streets, to see the buildings, I think that gives you some sense of what it must have been like. And I also want to see where these towns are now. Even though I know like the populations of most of them are not at what they used to be. But I still want to get that sense of, like even Tulsa, Oklahoma is very interesting to me because I went to college only 2 hours away from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I'd been to Tulsa, Oklahoma numerous times. I did not know about Greenwood until much, much later. And it was like one of those moments, how did I not know this?
And are many of those, I think about that one in particular, but a lot of these towns have many of them, I know you said that people have moved away, but how many of them were lost to eminent domain and other things?
So much.
So that there is really no history for you to uncover.
So much. You see that a lot in California because there's been a lot of news articles coming out in California, like there were these all-black communities or all-black resort towns because of eminent domain. The California government would take over them, move the people out. But under Newsom, a lot of these have been not necessarily returned to the original owners, but there's a process of finding out who owned the property and either paying them for it, and it, probably not what the land was worth, but like some form of reparations, if you will. But then sometimes returning these places back to the original inhabitants. And so you see it a lot in California because I've seen a lot of articles about it in California, not so much in the West or places like that. That's a little bit trickier. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, what place does Seneca Village have in this study of work?
So I'm going to allude to it.
Okay.
But as far as I know, there's not been any literature that I can find that's set in it. So I'm walking that very thin balance in the research. How much do I pay to historical towns, and then how much do I use the literary representations? But then another thing that might opens up is maybe I can write that novel or that short story. So yeah.
Yeah, and I thought about that because so much of what we've discussed seems so foreign, but if you are a New Yorker, that is a place that was once a small community.
It was, and from what I could read and from what I've discovered, it was thriving. It was really thriving until it was taken over to create Central Park.
Yeah. As you go through this process of doing this research and learning and eventually traveling to more places, how do you hope to bring some of this back to your classroom?
So what I would like to do is, unfortunately in the English department, we have a special topics course. And so it really is an opportunity for us as professors in the English department to teach our research interests. And so as I gather more information, propose a special topics course, or just slide into an English 102 course, like a unit. In my English 102 this semester, I'm teaching a short section on the Rwandan genocide because we're coming to the 32nd anniversary of it. Feels odd to say anniversary of a genocide, but marking 32 years of it. So I'm going to do that. And so there are ways to kind of bring it in and just to, I'm somewhat always reluctant to use this word, but to expose students to experiences or history that they may not have been aware of.
As you were talking about your research and talking about the all-black towns, like you could see this light, that you get very excited about it. Is this a project that you hope will come to fruition in the next year, next 2 years, I know that's hard. I know that's hard to say. The research sometimes dictates the time.
Oh, it does so much. So I'll give you the long answer to this.
That's okay.
During the fellowship leave, my grandiose plan was to do the research and have a copy of the manuscript. I was talking to a colleague of mine from a former institution, and she's like, "Oh, Danny," and she's like, "Oh, Danny," and so I've done a lot of the research, but there's still research to do, and there's still writing to do. And I remember advice that my dissertation advisor gave me. She said, "There's a point in time where you have to stop reading and sit down and write." So where I am right now, I'm still a little bit of the reading. So I'm thinking like in 2 years, hopefully 2 years, this project will see the light of day.
I'm certainly not holding you to a timeline, just very curious. And of course, in 2 years, you would definitely be filled with that work in addition to your teaching. But are there other things that interest you or other things you see, once this is done, something else has caught my interest?
So going back to the whole notion of the genocide, particularly the Rwandan genocide, I started to, and I've done some work with the Holocaust, but I also started to think literary representations of genocide, and we have the Holocaust, we have the Rwandan genocide, we have Cambodia. There's so many of them. And I'm wondering or one of the projects that I'm imagining is picking literature from a number of them and analyzing that literature to see how the authors treat it. But doing the same thing when I'm doing with All Black Towns, walking that thin balance between what we know of the history and then what the author does when she or he fictionalize elements. Because that's always a tricky thing when you fictionalize things such as the genocide, because I'm talking to a scholar who works on the Rwandan genocide specifically, and I was talking about different novels based on that. And I was going to use the novel that became the basis for the movie Hotel Rwanda. And because this is her scholarship, she said, that's a tricky novel that you should probably stay away from, because she said it's been found that he fictionalized a lot of what he did. And that, because it's an autobiographical memoir, she said, the sense that not all of that is true. And I thought, that's interesting. And so it's the way that we kind of like rewrite ourselves into history. So it's always that very thin line there. And so that's a project that I'm thinking about working on.
And I can see how that is a good fit for you. You're in Unseen Threads. You're part of the, I'm always messing up the acronym, but the Truth Racial Healing Center.
That is it, yeah.
You've worked extensively with Dr. Laura Cohen at the KHC. So this is along the lines, I think, of some of the work that you've been able to involve yourself and immerse yourself in at Queensborough. Would you say that Queensborough has been a great place for you to not just teach, but to really get deeper into things that you love to research?
100%. I feel like Queensborough has given me so many opportunities to explore avenues and channels that I don't know if I would have explored at another institution. Like at one institution, because my PhD is in Victorian literature, I was the Victorian lit person. And I was the only Victorian lit scholar on staff. So oftentimes I would tell the chair, well, I want to teach this course. And he's like, no, we need you to teach Victorian literature. But here I feel like, no, I want to explore this. And I was like, go for it. And so like that sense of being able to explore. And then there's so many initiatives that QCC has, and they come through the pipeline, and I think, yeah, that I like that.
I gotta get on that.
Yeah. But then also I had to walk that thin balance, because as I said before, I'm interested in almost everything. I was like, no, Danny, you can't do that one.
And I would think that if these opportunities are available for faculty, this must mean a wealth of opportunities for our students.
Oh yeah, completely.
In terms of what they can learn, how they can be mentored, and things that they can be exposed to.
Yeah, completely. And I think part of the issue there is, I think, just advertising that to students, but then also for students to carve out the time to participate in these events. We did a readathon yesterday on James Baldwin's Sons Blues. The attendance was okay. It could have been stronger, but then at the same time, I thought, students have classes. And so one my chair mentioned is like, maybe it would have been good to televise it, to use asynchronous and synchronous as a way to get more people involved when their schedule doesn't allow them to physically be in the space. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Danny, it's been wonderful chatting with you. I really am excited, especially, we've talked a little bit about your book, but just talking about it more, I'm like, oh, wow, I can't wait for this to be done. Yeah. And I won't keep tabs on your time, but I'll come back to you.
Please do. I mean, I think that's, I mean, every now and then a well-placed email is like, how's the research is going? Yeah, I will respect
Absolutely.
that. Yeah.
Well, I thank you so much. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation.
I did so much.
I've enjoyed having you.
Thank you very much.
And I hope that you will join us next time when we get to know someone else from Queensborough Community College.